Welcome to Cheese Media, a place where I, Kieran, like to talk about all the things that I like to talk about, namely pop culture, politics, how we all live in a society, and of course, cheese. I've called it Cheese Media because I really like cheese, and that's all there is to it. This, though, is the ferocious, the awe-inspiring, the terrible, Lula, resident little monster, and of course, the true star of all of my videos. I need you to drop this now. This time, we're going to be looking at Guy Debord's Society the Spectacle and the Godzilla franchise. Now, what you may ask, does a giant monster have to do with French critical theory from the 1960s? Well, stick around to find out.
Godzilla, one of the most recognisable icons in movie history, appearing in 38 movies since its debut in 1954. And, with more on the horizon, Godzilla shows no signs of slowing down. For those of you who aren't very familiar with Godzilla, it's basically a gargantuan lizard monster, so large it can destroy a skyscraper with a mere swipe of its tail, and in many of its depictions has atomic breath. It's often, though not always, pitted against other giant monsters.
Given that it's been a staple of the movie-making business for the last 75 years or so at time of recording, there isn't a single Godzilla continuity. In fact, as a franchise, it's known for constant reinvention, with wild variants in tone from one movie to the next.
From the modern legendary movies to Shin Godzilla, its multiple anime movies and TV shows, the 1998 So Bad It's Actually Kinda Good movie, and of course the huge library of Japanese kaiju monster bout movies, there's a lot of Godzilla stuff out there.
Which begs the question, what, if anything, is Godzilla actually about? Is it a metaphor for the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima? Is it a comment on humanity's destructive nature? Is it about nature taking revenge upon humanity? Or is it just meaningless popcorn fodder? Well, let's get deep into Godzilla to find out. And I mean that in a completely family-friendly way.
In late January 1954, the Japanese fishing boat Lucky Dragon 5 set off on its fifth ocean voyage. The ship was out at sea all the way until mid-March. At some point during this period, the crew lost most of the trawling nets, and so they altered course, bringing them south of the Marshall Islands. The USA were conducting nuclear tests at this time at Bikini Atoll, and the Lucky Dragon 5 was a mere 14 miles outside of the danger area. The only problem? The nuclear test was much more powerful than had been intended. The ship and its crew encountered radioactive dust, and in less than a day were exhibiting signs of radiation sickness. By the time they got back to port 2 weeks later, the crew were suffering from a litany of issues, including burnt skin, hair loss, and bleeding gums. This resulted in the death of at least one of the crew, with others suffering various medical issues. The memory of both Nagasaki and Hiroshima was still very fresh in Japanese minds. Outrage at the United States was rife, and the first global protest against the use of nuclear weapons began as a result. It's no coincidence, then, that the very first Godzilla movie, released that same year, begins with the crew of a ship encountering the monster at sea. From there, a cascade of disaster and destruction begins as Godzilla destroys a number of ships. The movie instills a sense of dread early on, as each time a boat is sent out to rescue or investigate, it too is destroyed. The references to nuclear weapons don't stop there either. It is theorised within the movie that underwater hydrogen bomb testing is what drew the monster out of its deep-sea environment in the first place. Some survivors of encounters with Godzilla are diagnosed with radiation sickness as a result of being near the monster. Eventually, a scientist comes up with a way to kill Godzilla and saves the day. But the movie ends with the character musing that if nuclear testing continues, then humanity may not have seen the last of Godzilla's kind. The movie was hugely successful in Japan, and an American version was also released, though, interestingly enough, this one removed a lot of the references to the USA nuclear testing and spliced an American character into the movie for good measure. A sequel was released the very next year, titled Godzilla Raids Again. This is the earliest example of what the Godzilla franchise would become, as the plot centres around Godzilla battling another giant dinosaur-like creature.
The film was less successful than its predecessor, however, and things went quiet for the Godzilla franchise for several years, but Toho, the studio behind the first two Godzilla films, were still interested in making kaiju movies.
So in 1956 they made Rodan, the first colour movie in what would retrospectively become the Godzilla franchise. I say retrospectively because Godzilla doesn't appear in Rodan, but Rodan does appear in later subsequent Godzilla movies.
And that might have been it for the Godzilla franchise, were it not for a certain gorilla, a cinematic predecessor of Godzilla, a colleague, if you will, sometimes ally, sometimes nemesis. Reminds me of my relationship with Janet from work. Yes, of course, I'm talking about King Kong.
A man named Willis O'Brien was trying to get a movie idea off the ground. Funnily enough, the premise was actually that Kong would go up against a giant Frankenstein monster. Yes, this is true, I'm not making this up. Eventually, Toho came on board as they had long been hoping to produce a Japanese King Kong movie. They replaced Giant Frankenstein with Godzilla, and the movie was released in 1963, 7 years after Godzilla raids again. It's here that we start to see a tonal shift in the Godzilla movies. Long gone are the mournful musings of the destructive nature of humanity's recklessness. Instead, we get... But the film was hugely successful, and so inevitably more movies followed in rapid succession. In its next outing, Godzilla battled Mothra, a giant moth who had its own movie in 1961. But it's in the next movie, titled Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster, that Godzilla moves from antagonist towards the anti-hero most people are familiar with today. Godzilla teams up with Mothra and Rodan to take on Ghidorah, who, as the title very clearly explains, is a three-headed monster. This destructive alien is too much for Godzilla to take on its own, and so all three monsters team up to destroy it.
And then the next year, well, you get the idea.
We're in the money! We're in the money!
And so finally, Terror of Mechagodzilla releases in 1975, and unfortunately it doesn't do great at the box office. Toho decides that audiences have had enough of Godzilla for a while, and they decide to put Godzilla back on the shelf, ending what would become known as the Shōwa era of Godzilla movies, so named because it coincided with the reign of Emperor Shōwa, the 124th Emperor of Japan.
This was only ever intended to be a temporary hiatus, however, and the franchise was rebooted in 1984 with the return of Godzilla. This was the beginning of the Heisei era of Godzilla movies.
In this movie, a new Godzilla re-emerges and begins to attack Japan, and retreads a lot of the story beats from the original movie. Think of this one as the Batman Begins of the Godzilla franchise, an attempt to bring Godzilla back to its antagonistic roots and a return to a darker tone. The movie also attempts to bring the nuclear theme of Godzilla front and centre again, this time evoking the tensions of the Cold War. Godzilla is described as a walking nuclear weapon within the movie, and as the plot progresses, a diplomatic crisis develops, with both the USA and the Soviet Union attempting to pressure the Prime Minister of Japan into deploying nuclear weapons against the monster. But this new darker tone doesn't really stay around for very long. In its next outing, Godzilla is once again battling another giant monster, this one a combination of some cells from Godzilla, a plant, and a human. So, yeah. The Heisei era was very much a compacted retread of the Shōwa era, being just 7 movies stretched over 9 years, where the Shōwa era ran for 21 years with 15 movies, and that isn't including movies such as Mothra or Rodan where Godzilla doesn't even appear. Anyway, after just 7 movies, Toho decided to retire Godzilla again in 1995 with Godzilla vs. Destroyer, wherein Godzilla dies and passes the torch to son of Godzilla.
The Heisei era initially takes itself quite seriously, but it very quickly gets real weird, introducing time travel, a plant monster, a space Godzilla, to name just a few things. It's balls to the walls schlockiness and schlockiness. It's balls to the walls schlockiness, and it's a joy to watch for that. But as time goes on, the movies devolve into more simplistic spectacles, and it really starts to feel like they don't really have much of anything to say about anything. Speaking of which,
this is the one that people absolutely hated. It's a truly bizarre movie. Being set in New York, full of wacky New York type characters, it kind of feels like an episode of Friends that just happens to feature Godzilla. To be honest, there isn't much to say about this movie. In terms of the nuclear metaphor, it's a complete whitewash. Godzilla's nuclear evolution is caused by the French this time round. The bloody French. I think that's probably the most interesting thing about the movie, that Hollywood was so afraid that American audiences wouldn't enjoy a movie where the monster is created by their reckless foreign policy, so they just blamed the French instead.
I remember when this movie came out, I would have been about 12 or so I was the perfect age to enjoy it, really. The marketing campaign was absolutely huge. There were adverts and posters everywhere.
Over here in the UK, this led to the older movies being broadcast on TV, and I personally got my first taste of a real Godzilla movie when I watched the original Godzilla vs Mechagodzilla.
A friend and I even took possession of a cardboard cutout of the movie's poster from our local Blockbuster. But that being said, this movie made no impact on my child brain whatsoever. And that says it all, really. In fact, I think I remember the marketing campaign for this movie much more vividly than I remember seeing the movie itself.
While the original Jurassic Park movie lingers on in the brain of everyone who was a kid around this time, Godzilla 1998 barely made a mark on the cultural landscape. It was very much a sign of things to come for Hollywood. This was an attempt not to bring Godzilla into the American mainstream or tell a compelling story, but a movie made for the purposes of its own marketing campaign. It existed to make money and nothing more.
The movie was considered so bad that it inspired Toho to take the reins of the Godzilla franchise once again, and in 1999 they made Godzilla 2000.
That's right, just like everything else in 1999, it just waxed the number 2000 on the end for no apparent reason. This was the first of what would become known as the Millennium era of Godzilla movies. The Millennium era was weird. First, this era is a reaction to the American Godzilla movie, one that was hated by Toho and the Godzilla fanbase so much that it became referred to as G-I-N-O, or Gino, meaning Godzilla in name only. Toho had planned not to make any more Godzilla movies until at least 2005, but their disappointment with the 1998 movie caused them to bring their plans forward by 6 years. And if that wasn't enough, in GMK, All Out Monsters Attack, the events of the 1998 movie are referenced as actually happening, but it is stated that the monster wasn't actually the real Godzilla. And just to make extra clear that as many people as possible now knew that Toho did not consider this to be a legitimate Godzilla, the monster from the 1998 movie, now dubbed simply as Zilla, appears in Godzilla Final Wars, and is dispatched by the real Godzilla in a matter of seconds. The second thing that makes the Millennium era quite odd is that unlike the Shōwa and Heisei era movies, most of the movies in the Millennium era are set in their own continuities. This really speaks to how well established Godzilla was at this point in the cultural zeitgeist. Everyone knew what Godzilla was, so why bother to reintroduce it? And why let each story get bogged down in ever more convoluted lore? Most of them also have Godzilla already being a known threat to the world, rather than focusing the narrative on a first encounter with humanity. Another common thread here is that Godzilla also lives past the end of each movie in one way or another, and there's little to no focus on the nuclear theme. Godzilla as a metaphor becomes more elemental, something that always has been and always will be.
Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, all-out giant monsters. Godzilla, Mothra and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack is a terrible title, but it is an interesting movie because it not only deliberately engages with what Godzilla means, but it also takes the metaphor and completely shakes things up.
This movie introduces the idea that Godzilla is the embodiment of those killed by the Imperial Japanese Army during the Second World War. In doing so, it reacquaints the Godzilla mythos with an anti-war or anti-violence message. Godzilla in this movie is lashing out against Japan for its denial of its past crimes. At the end of the movie, our heroes think they have defeated Godzilla once and for all, but at the bottom of the ocean, Godzilla's heart continues to beat, suggesting perhaps that there is no getting away from the more difficult elements of the past. All a country can do is face up to what it's done.
Or you can just blame France. Whatever.
The Millennium era ended in 2004 with Godzilla Final Wars, and then things for Godzilla go quiet for quite some time. In fact, it wasn't until 2014's Godzilla, produced in the US by Legendary Pictures, that the overgrown lizard would once again arrive on our screens. This was Hollywood's second stab at Godzilla, and bless them, they really tried. And to be fair, it is a much better movie than the 1998 version. However, I do have one gripe with this movie. This time around, Godzilla is awakened by a deep-sea expedition, and the nuclear tests of the 1950s were attempts to kill the monster.
Now, to me, this is worse than just blaming the French. This time round, the nuclear tests, which resulted in the deaths and the suffering of Japanese fishermen, were actively given a justification. The movie merely pays lip service to the original, without engaging with its anti-establishment stance. Take, for example, the role of Godzilla in this movie. By the end of the film, Godzilla assumes the role of the protector of mankind. And in that vein, and this being an American-made movie, I can't help but feel that maybe what this is a metaphor for nuclear deterrent, as opposed to actually being anti-nuclear weapons.
Following Godzilla 2014, we have the 2019 Godzilla King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021, and Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire in 2024. To be honest, there's not much to say about these movies. They manage to be incredibly stupid and boring at the same time, and they don't really even attempt to say anything, other than how we should respect nature or something. And look, I agree with that sentiment, it's just that, and this might shock you, it comes off as rather insincere.
This was now the Reiwa era of the Godzilla franchise, so named for the 232nd Emperor of Japan.
So let's talk about 2016's Shin Godzilla, which I think is a really interesting movie. In fact, in my humble opinion, it's probably the best contemporary Godzilla movie that there is.
Why? Well, because it actually manages to be about something, and it's relevant to the time that it was made in, which is sort of kind of, what art is meant to do.
The movie is set in modern day Japan, and it focuses on how a contemporary bureaucratic government would actually deal with the threat posed by a giant monster. The film draws its inspiration primarily from the Fukushima nuclear disaster that occurred in 2011, the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. The movie is loaded with visual references to the Fukushima incident. An earthquake and tsunami resulted in electrical failure, damaging nearly all of the Fukushima power plant's backup energy sources. This resulted in reactors overheating and nuclear contamination. But what makes this different from other Godzilla movies are the satirical elements at play within the plot. The emergence of the monster is responded to with a series of meetings and disastrous press conferences. For example, the scientists that the government consults to advise on the monster tell them that it could never walk on land. The Prime Minister confidently announces this on air, and almost immediately, Godzilla emerges out of the water and starts causing havoc on land. But it's not just the satirical elements that make this iteration stand out either. This version of Godzilla evolves throughout the movie. When I say evolves, I don't mean actual evolution, I mean more like a Pokemon evolution. It sounds silly, yeah, but it actually results in one of the most interesting aspects of the movie. So, the plot starts with an encounter with the monster in a sort of larval stage. It emerges on the shores of Tokyo and starts chaotically crawling through the streets, leaving destruction in its wake before transforming and evolving into a bipedal version of Godzilla. The Godzilla as we know it doesn't really appear until about halfway through the movie. Finally, our heroes manage to stop Godzilla by freezing it with chemicals, and the film ends with a shot at the end of the monster's tail. It shows these human-like figures that appear to be growing out of the tail, suggesting Godzilla's next evolution was headed off just in time. But more than that, it's a provocation to us as the audience to reflect on humanity's destructive nature.
And this underpins what's best about Godzilla for me. Godzilla is about Japan talking to itself, trying to acknowledge and reckon with real-life man-made disasters. It's a very real, very genuine attempt to make sense of not just the disasters themselves, but how people react and adapt to these situations, and how they overcome them.
Shin Godzilla is far from a perfect movie. The CGI pales in comparison to other Godzilla movies of this era, for one. And while the countless meetings do a great job at taking a stab at the bureaucratic incompetence, they do get a bit boring after a while. Also, there's a lack of concentration when it comes to the human cost of the disaster Godzilla represents. The only human characters we get to know are politicians, who are largely insulated from most of the danger on screen. But, for me at least, it does remain one of the most distinctive modern Godzilla movies, and I can only hope its recently announced sequel is anywhere as close to being as interesting. And finally, we have Godzilla Minus One. Out of the many, many Godzilla films that there are, and we've barely scratched the surface, Godzilla Minus One is probably the closest in terms of the remake of the original 1954 movie. Its setting mirrors that of the post-war original, and it once again places human relationships at the centre of its narrative. This helps to focus the story back on the cost of human lives affected by the devastation the monster leaves in its wake, and it's all the more effective for it.
For me, it probably is the less interesting of the two modern Toho Godzilla movies. By copying a lot of the elements of the 1954 original, it plays things a bit safe, but it also has a broader genuine appeal than Shin Godzilla, and it does really attempt to focus on the human connection that's important to these movies, something that Shin Godzilla seems to lack. And it's a genuinely entertaining Godzilla movie. With its post-World War II setting, and its focus on human relationships, we again get a sense of the traumas Japan as a country has experienced.
Like many movies in the franchise before it, the movie ends with a hint that the threat of Godzilla is far from over, and more disaster looms on the horizon.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Disaster does always loom on the horizon. That's just part of the human condition. Whether it be a nuclear disaster or something much more intimate, such as losing a loved one or experiencing a mental health crisis, we all become familiar with disaster throughout our lives. And even though we are beset by these things, even though we know that there will be more disasters in the future, we carry on and we cling to our humanity because that is what makes us what we are. The Godzilla franchise, for all the attempts to monetize and simplify, it keeps finding ways to reevaluate what it means to live through disaster and emerge on the other side. And now, please don't turn off, because it's time to talk about French situationist theory. Society of the Spectacle is the foundational text of what is known as situationist theory, a development of Marxist theory that explores the isolationism and emptiness of the commodification of everything. So maybe don't read it on a Monday.
In order to understand Guy Debord and Society of the Spectacle, we need to talk about Situationist International and its influences. Situationist International were a group of avant-garde, artsy-fartsy and intellectual types.
They were influenced by the Dadaists, Surrealists and the movement known as Lettrism. And if you don't know what those terms mean, well, obviously I'm going to explain them now.
Dadaism was an art movement that was responding to the First World War and the societies that emerged from it. The way they saw it, the incomprehensible horror of the war had rendered life absurd, and so their art reflected this idea. The Dadaist perspective is that anything has the potential to be perceived as art. Perhaps the most well-known Dada art piece is The Fountain, a urinal placed upon its side in an art gallery. Surrealism emerged in the same period as Dadaism, and the two movements influenced each other. It was also said to be associated with anarchy and communism. It was all about exploring the unconscious through art, questioning reality and blending reality with that of dreams to create a sort of super reality. Think Salvador Dali and his melting clocks. Meanwhile, Lettrism emerged in the 1940s and was influenced by Surrealism. Lettrism sought to explore a letter, e.g. A or B, beyond its use as a construction of language, and to explore and redefine the relationship between text, sound and image.
You have oh, things like well, but you use this letters mixed with letters like A, O, B, C.
No word is capable of carrying the impulses one wants to send with it. Its founder, Isidore Izu, once said. Only, he said it in French. Meaning that language on its own is not only not enough to express something, but it can actually stifle meaning and expression.
The Lettrists were direct forerunners to the Situationists, and their magazine, Situationist International.
The Situationists believed that creativity under capitalism was stifled, unable to fulfill its true purpose and potential. They believed that capitalism had divided society into artists and audiences, those who produced the art and those who consumed it. Guy Debord became their most important figure and wrote Society of the Spectacle in 1967, with a follow-up book titled Comments on the Society of the Spectacle in 1988.
In the book, Debord argues that authentic social life has been replaced with mere representation, and this has been achieved through what he refers to as the spectacle.
The spectacle upholds the status quo and crushes dissent with pacification achieved by means of distraction. It commodifies meaning and sells it back to us, the consumer.
Perhaps the most classic example would be a Che Guevara t-shirt, the image of a communist revolutionary co-opted and sold in a complete contradiction of what Che Guevara stood for.
Have you ever watched the news and found yourself really frustrated at the direction that a certain story was being taken by the journalists involved?
And then on the rare occasion that they get challenged for this, they say, but that's just the story. Well, Debord found this really annoying too, arguing that what's discussed in the media is often assumed to be what's important, but actually that understanding has things backwards. Because it is the media that decides what's important and what's worthy of discussion. What is more visible becomes misunderstood for what is more important. Society of the Spectacle is a critique of capitalism. It identifies the obsession of capitalism towards profit and growth, and concludes that this undermines any attempts to be truly creative. And in the same way, it works against the common good of people and the planet. Everything becomes something we can buy, something we can own. Every creative idea becomes a mere image to be absorbed unthinkingly. The truly tragic thing about this is that commodities are inherently unsatisfying, and so with each consumption, we simply move on, looking for the next mindless movie, the next empty kernel of popcorn to consume, in the vain hope that we will then finally feel fulfilled. Debord lays out 3 kinds of spectacle, the first being the concentrated spectacle. This is when every aspect of life is driven by propaganda. It often occurs in societies beset by war or some other kind of crisis, and it tends to associate itself with a powerful political leader who rules through violence and intimidation. The second kind, the diffuse spectacle, is most often paired with capitalism. Everything is geared towards consumption for the sake of it, often at the cost of actual necessities and common sense thinking. Then, in his 1988 follow-up book, Comments on the Society of the Spectacle, Debord takes the diffuse spectacle and the concentrated spectacle and fuses them into the integrated spectacle. So this would be late-stage capitalism, what we live in now. As the system starts to collapse under its own weight of constant consumption, as economic balance shifts ever in favour of the more wealthy and further away from common people, both state violence and distraction are employed to maintain the status quo. So, right now, you're probably asking yourself, what does the Society of the Spectacle have to do with Godzilla? For me, it all comes down to what could be described as this ever-evolving battle for what Godzilla represents thematically, if anything. The first movie was a money-making enterprise, of course it was. But it was more than just that. It had something to say, and it was an original idea. But after that movie, every Godzilla movie, every Godzilla TV show or piece of merchandise becomes something made almost purely to just make money. And it's far from a unique example in that regard. But what interests me is that Godzilla becomes a battleground for meaning itself. The 1954 movie is almost a punk art piece of subversive and rebellious ideas. It was made at a time when the US was still occupying Japan, and the movie was heavily critical of the US's military actions. You have to admire the creative bravery of making a movie like this in that kind of political environment. The driving force behind the original 1954 Godzilla movie was a fierce and open criticism of US foreign policy towards Japan. But this idea becomes almost immediately diluted by the presence of a sequel rushed out a year later. The franchise quickly moves on to these rumbles between men in monster suits. The first sequel was rushed out within a year, and it was clearly meant to capitalise on the original movie's success. The loss of human lives as these titans battle out becomes secondary, merely a stake in driving the drama of the plot rather than being central to the plot itself. We're no longer invited to think about the decimated lives, the ruptured families, the years of work it will take to clear up and rebuild. And when the movie ends, well, it's never too long until a sequel appears on the horizon. Every movie after the original is doing the same thing. Even movies like All Out Monsters Attack or Shin Godzilla, which, they are making these genuine attempts to re-engage and re-envision with the political and metaphorical elements that make the original so special. But really, they're just relying on an established IP to make more money. As I mentioned earlier, a Shin Godzilla sequel is coming out soon, and I just can't help but feel that the ideas that make the 2016 movie interesting will once again be overlooked, or at best just repeated. And Godzilla Minus One, a really good movie, sure, but it is just a rehash of the original right down to its post-World War II setting. And so the cycle continues. The meanings become diluted and lost, subsumed by lore, childish monster bouts seen many times over. Attempts to revitalise that rarely hit the mark, and even when they do, start to lose the meaning all over again with the next movie. The sheer amount of movies dilutes the potency of the stories being told, and the true motivation for telling these stories, profit, becomes clearer and clearer. And even when the movies actually have something interesting to say, and are able to depict it in a thought-provoking way, This is undermined by that contextual knowledge we have as the audience. Each movie, the enthusiasm wanes a little bit more, the disappointment grows, and you start to question whether any of these movies were actually any good in the first place. And this even occurs with a studio like Toho, a studio that genuinely seems to care about the integrity of their franchise, which we can see from their reaction to the 1998 Godzilla movie. Other than, say, James Bond, for example, there aren't too many movie icons you can really compare to Godzilla when it comes to the longevity of the franchise and the sheer amount of movies. But the thing about James Bond is, he's just a character. When you get past all the schmooziness, all the poker games, all the shooting, he's just a man. But Godzilla isn't a character. No, Godzilla is elemental, gargantuan not just in size, but in its sheer capacity for meaning. But, all too easily, this powerful metaphor becomes reduced to a mere spectacle. The art, the brave and subversive messaging gets lost. It's rendered meaningless, banal, facile, stupid even. Like a man, fast approaching his 40s, playing around in his room with his toys, dressing his dog up as a monster, acting like a complete and utter twat.